I am 74 years old. Saying it out loud still sounds weird, like age doesn't suit me, or like I've lived someone else's life. For a long time, I believed what they told me. I believed that this was normal, that it was careful, that it was love. Today, sitting in silence, I understand that it was nothing like that. It was just control disguised as a rule. For almost my entire life, I followed orders without asking why. Not because I agreed, but because I learned early on that questioning had consequences. Hard looks, prolonged silences, a heavy feeling in my chest that I couldn't explain. So I adapted. I kept quiet. I learned to swallow words even before they were born. I grew up hearing that I was a good boy, that it didn't take work, that I knew my place. This has always been said as a compliment, and I accepted it as such. I never realized that behind these words there was a silent demand, not to feel too much, not to want too much, not to be too much. Just obey and move on. The house where I grew up was simple, organized, too quiet for a child. There were no constant screams, no dramatic scenes. The control came in a calm, almost polite way. Rules that were not written but were felt. Things that were not done. Questions that were not asked. Emotions that were not shown. I believed that all families were like that. That growing up was learning to shape yourself. What discomfort was part of life. When something bothered me, I thought the problem was with me, that I was too sensitive, too weak. So I tried to improve. I tried to adjust even more. They never asked me what I wanted, and over time, I stopped asking myself. I started to accept decisions as if they were inevitable, as if there was no other option. My silence was interpreted as agreement. No one realized, or pretended not to, that I just didn't know how to say no. Today, looking back, I realize how much I was trained to accept. Accepting unfair rules. Accept choices that weren't mine. Accept a lifetime without complaining. And the more I accepted, the more distant I became from myself, even without knowing that I was losing myself. At that time, I thought that obeying would protect me, that following rules would keep me safe, that pleasing was a way of being loved. No one ever told me otherwise. Nobody taught me that I also had the right to a voice, the will, the choice. I just followed what was expected of me. Over the years, this obedience became part of my identity. I was the reliable one, the person in charge, the one that didn't cause problems. Inside, however, there was a constant feeling of tightness, as if something was always out of place, but I couldn't point out what. There was no specific moment when everything started to go wrong. It was more like a silent buildup, small daily renunciations, small silences swallowed, small pains ignored. Everything seemed too small to question, and too big to bear. I lived like this for decades. I built a respectable life in the eyes of others. I fulfilled expectations. I followed paths already traced. I did what was expected, and yet something inside me remained empty, as if I had gone through life without actually participating in it. Today, at 74, I finally understand. I understand that many of the rules I followed were not fair. That much of what they called care was just control. That my silence didn't protect me. It just erased me little by little. This is not a story about revolt. It's a story about hindsight. About understanding, too late perhaps, that being quiet had a high price. And that some truths take a lifetime to begin to be told. The fact that you've chosen to hear this far says a lot about who you are. What I'm going to share next isn't just part of my story. It's something that quietly touches on many people's lives. If you believe that truths like this deserve to continue being told, subscribe to the channel. This is the simplest way to ensure that these stories are not silenced again. The house where I grew up was not too big, nor too small. It was simple, clean, organized in an almost rigid way. Everything had its place, and I learned early on that getting out of that place, even if it was just a little, caused discomfort. There was no mess, no loud laughter. The silence was constant, as if it were part of the structure of the house. I remember the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway, always measured, always careful. I learned to walk without making noise, to close doors slowly, to breathe low when someone was in a bad mood. It was as if the whole environment called for caution, not out of explicit fear, but out of habit, an excessive care that became the rule. My parents were not violent, at least not in the way that many people imagine. There were no daily screams, no visible punishments. Control came in another way. It came in the stares too long, in the pauses before answering, in that silence that said everything without saying anything. I understood quickly when I had crossed some invisible limit. From a young age, I heard that a well-bred child was a quiet child, and I strove to be that. When I wanted something, I thought twice before asking. When something bothered me, I kept it to myself. Gradually, I learned that feeling was not a priority. The important thing was not to cause problems. There was no room for open conversation. Questions were seen as a challenge. Curiosity was confused with stubbornness. So I observed more than I spoke. He paid attention to the tone of voice, the atmosphere of the house, the mood of each one. I learned to adapt before I even understood why. Sometimes I saw other children being looser, louder, freer, but I believed that was wrong, that they were naughty. After all, that's what they told me. I prided myself on being different, to be what they called easy to create. I didn't realize the weight hidden in this compliment. In that house, rules were rarely explained. They simply existed. Because it's always been like that. And that was enough. I didn't learn the reason for things. I just learned to accept them. And the more I accepted it, the less I felt like questioning. There were days when I felt a strange tightness in my chest, without knowing how to explain it. A feeling of always being attentive, always on alert. But no one talked about feelings. So I didn't speak either. I learned to pretend that everything was fine, even when something clearly wasn't. I believed that growing up meant that learning to restrain yourself, swallow desires, to mold themselves to what they expected. It didn't cross my mind that it could be unfair. After all, it was the only world I knew. And when something is all you know, you call it normal. Over time, I began to take pride in my self-control, of my ability to endure, not to complain. I saw it as strength, as early maturity. Today, I understand that it was just emotional survival, disguised as virtue. The house remained the same, year after year. The walls held secrets that were never told. The rules remained firm, even without being written, and I was still there, learning to fit in, to diminish, to disappear a little more every day. There was no declared evil, and maybe that's why it was so difficult to understand. Control did not come with violence, it came with normality, and that's what makes it so dangerous. When everything seems calm, you don't realize how much you're being silenced. It was in that house that I learned the most enduring lesson of my life. Not written anywhere, but repeated every day. Staying quiet is safer. Questioning is expensive. And for a long time, I believed this without ever doubting. In my family, love was never something said out loud. It came disguised as guidance, constant correction, rules that were said to be for my good. No one hugged me to ask how I felt. Instead, they taught me how I should behave, and that was called care. My father believed that discipline formed character. He didn't say much, but when he did, it was definitive. His words did not come as an invitation to the conversation, but as the end of it. I was quick to nod in agreement, even when something tightened inside. Disagreeing never seemed like a real option. My mother was more present, but also more vigilant. I knew exactly when I was different, when something in me threatened to get out of the expected control. He didn't ask why. He just corrected it. It adjusted, like straightening an object out of place. I felt that I always needed to be right so as not to disappoint. Important decisions never passed through me. They were communicated, not discussed. And they were always accompanied by the same short and indisputable explanation. It's the best for you. Over time, I learned not to look for alternatives. If it was the best, then I just had to accept it. When I made a mistake, there was no screaming. There was silence. A heavy silence which lasted for hours, sometimes days. That hurt more than any scolding. I felt small, inadequate, like I had failed at something essential. So I made an effort not to make mistakes again. To be commended meant to be obedient. He doesn't give trouble, they said to the others. And I smiled proudly, not understanding that that compliment carried a condition. I was only good as long as I stayed within the mold. Outside of it, I didn't know who it was. I never heard my parents talk about dreams, nor about personal choices. Life seemed like a fixed script, and it was up to me to follow it correctly. It wasn't about evil, I know that today. But it wasn't about freedom either. It was control, even if well-intentioned. I didn't know how to differentiate between orientation and imposition. Everything was mixed. When they told me what to do, I believed they were protecting me. I didn't realize that little by little, they were deciding who I would be, and I quietly allowed it. There were times when I felt like saying something different, expressing my own opinion, but the fear of disappointment spoke louder. I preferred to remain silent rather than run the risk of being seen as ungrateful. After all, they did everything for me. Over time, I internalized that surveillance. Even when I was alone, I policed myself. I thought about what was right before thinking about what I wanted. The rules no longer needed to be said. They lived inside me, guiding every step. I thought that was maturity, that I was more responsible than the others. It was only many years later that I understood that that early responsibility had a high cost. I grew up without learning to listen to myself. In that family, control was taken care of. Silence was respect. Obedience was love. And I accepted all of this as absolute truth. Not because I agreed, but because I was never taught that I could disagree. It was there that I began to disappear little by little, not dramatically, but slowly, almost imperceptibly. I was still physically present, but my voice was already starting to fade, and I had no idea how much it would shape my entire life. I don't remember a single moment when someone said clearly that my opinion didn't matter. That's not how I learned. It was something much more subtle. She gradually realized that when I tried to speak, the subject changed, or someone answered for me, or they simply ignored what I said, as if it had not been relevant. When I expressed a preference, a correction soon came. This is not for you. You don't know what's best. Trust us. At first, I insisted a little. Then I stopped. It was easier to agree than to sustain that discomfort of not being taken seriously. At school, I was the well-behaved student, which did not question the teacher, the one who accepted rules even when they didn't make sense. That was praised. At home, too, I was being molded on all sides to believe that thinking on my own was unnecessary, perhaps even dangerous. There were situations where I clearly felt that something was unfair. Small things, simple decisions, choices that could have been mine, but there was always a ready justification, said with such certainty, that I began to doubt myself. I thought that maybe I was exaggerating, that the problem was my sensitivity. I learned to swallow whole sentences. They went up to the throat and died there. I rehearsed answers in my head, but I never said them out loud. Over time, even rehearsing became useless. I already knew the result before I even tried it. The hardest thing was not to obey. It was realizing that no one seemed interested in what I felt. There was no curiosity about my thoughts, just expectation of behavior. I existed more as someone who needed to function properly than as someone who needed to be understood. I remember feeling ashamed when I disagreed inside, as if that simple thought was already a failure. I didn't speak, but I blamed myself for feeling differently. And this silent guilt was accumulating, creating a confusion that I couldn't explain. Over time, I started to anticipate myself. Before anyone decided for me, I already accepted it mentally. It was a way to protect myself from frustration. If I didn't create expectations, I wouldn't be disappointed. At least that's what I believed. I watched adults talking about me, deciding things about my life, as if I wasn't there. And I really wasn't. At least not entirely. A part of me had already learned to hide so as not to bother. No one ever asked me directly what I wanted to be. The path seemed too obvious to need conversation. And I kept going, believing that at some point it would make sense, that I would later understand. That later took a lifetime. At that stage, I no longer tried to be heard. I just tried not to make mistakes, do not disappoint, do not cause discomfort. My identity began to form around that. I was the one who accepted, that he didn't complain, that he adapted. Today, looking back, I see how decisive that was. It was not a great violence. It was something minor, repeated every day. The absence of listening, the certainty of others about me, the space that was never given to me. It was there that I understood, even without words, that my opinion had no weight. And when you grow up believing that, you learn to live like you don't have a right to it. I learned this lesson all too well, and it took me decades to begin to unlearn it. There was a specific moment when my life changed direction, although at the time I didn't understand it that way. It was not announced as something serious. There was no drama, no discussion. It was just communicated, like so many other things before. A decision already made, placed before me as a fait accompli. I remember the tone used, calm, safe, as if there was no room for doubt. Someone said it was the best way, that I would understand over time, that this was necessary. I was silent, hoping that at some point, they would ask me what I thought. That moment never came. Inside me, something contracted. It wasn't anger, it was confusion, a strange feeling of being pushed into a place I didn't choose. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't organize. The fear of looking ungrateful paralyzed me. My silence was interpreted as agreement. No one questioned it. No one realized that I was just trying to survive that moment. It was as if, by not reacting, I was making their job easier, making everything simpler, for them. I remember thinking that maybe I was exaggerating, that if everyone said it was the best, then it should be. I learned early on to distrust my own feelings, so I swallowed that uncomfortable feeling and did what I always did. I accepted. The explanations came later, all very similar. It's for your good. You'll thank you in the future. Everyone goes through this. These phrases were said so naturally that I began to repeat them inside my own head, as if they were absolute truths. That day, I felt something move inside me. Not that I understood at the time, but something has changed. A line was crossed. I realized, even without being able to formulate it, that certain choices in my life did not belong to me. There was no room for mourning. No one talked about how I felt. so I didn't say it either. I kept it all somewhere quiet inside me, believing that this was what mature people did. They accepted. They moved on. I obeyed. I did what they expected. I showed that I was responsible, that he understood, that it wouldn't cause any problems. I received compliments for that. And on the outside, it looked like everything was right. But inside, something began to slowly fade. Over time, that decision came to be treated as inevitable, like something that would have always happened. Even I myself started telling the story in this way. I erased my absence of choice from the narrative, as if it had never existed. Today, looking back, I realized that that was a turning point. Not because it was the most painful moment, but because it was the moment when I learned, definitively, that my life could be decided without me. I wasn't physically forced. I was not threatened. I was convinced to keep quiet. And this is more difficult to explain, because on the outside it looked normal, but inside it was the beginning of a long distance between who I was and who I should have been. That day, I didn't just miss a choice. I lost a piece of confidence in myself. And it took me many years to realize how much this would influence everything that came after. After that decision, the phrases began to be repeated more frequently, always said in the same calm, almost careful tone. It's for your good. As if this ended any possibility of doubt. As if the mere fact that someone says this transforms the choice into something automatically correct. Whenever I showed any hesitation, even the slightest, a new explanation came. They said I was still too young to understand, that one day I would be grateful, that it would avoid problems in the future. And I wanted to believe it. I had to believe, because questioning would mean facing something for which I was not prepared. These words had a strange effect on me. At the same time that they calmed me down on the outside, they confused me on the inside. If it was for my good, why did I feel so uncomfortable? Why was there that constant weight on my chest, as if I was carrying something that didn't belong to me? Nobody talked about feeling, so I didn't speak either. I kept everything in silence, believing that it was maturity, that growing up meant learning to accept difficult things without complaining. I convinced myself that the discomfort was a sign of my weakness, not of injustice. Over time, I began to repeat these phrases to myself. When something bothered me, I thought, it's for my good. When I felt like stepping back, I told myself that it was necessary. It was as if their voice had settled inside my head. There was a constant normalization of everything. Nothing was treated as excessive. Nothing was questioned. If it hurt, it was because it needed to hurt. If I felt lost, it was because I still hadn't understood. This simple logic kept me stuck, without realizing it. I observed other adults agreeing with each other, reinforcing those ideas. They all seemed right. Everyone seemed safe. And I felt small in the face of this collective certainty. Who was I to disagree? Who was I to say that something was wrong? Gradually, I learned not to show any reaction, neither sadness nor anger. He just nodded. This behavior was rewarded with approval, with discreet compliments, with the feeling that I was doing the right thing, even if inside something was going out. Silence has become an invisible requirement. It didn't need to be asked anymore. I already knew when it was time to be quiet, when it was better not to insist, when it was safer to accept. This constant adaptation has become automatic. I didn't realize that it was shaping who I would be. I thought it was just a phase, that later everything would fall into place, that at some point I would have room to choose. But that moment never came. There was always another rule, another decision. Another is for your good. As time went on, I began to withdraw from myself. My desires were confused. My desires diffuse. I no longer knew how to differentiate what I wanted from what was expected of me. Everything was mixed. Today, looking back, I understand the power of that phrase. She didn't come to protect, he came to silence, to end conversations before they even start. And it worked. It worked for many years. In that period, without realizing it, I learned one of the hardest lessons of my life. When someone decides for you and calls it care, questioning seems wrong. And I believed that for too long. There was not a scream, nor a striking scene that I could point to as the exact moment of the rupture. It was quieter than that. It was internal. Something that broke without making a sound, like a fragile thing breaking inside, while on the outside, everything remained exactly the same. I woke up that day, as on so many others, following the routine that I no longer questioned. I did what was expected of me. I listened to what I needed to hear. I agreed with what was said. But there was a different feeling, difficult to explain, a new weight, as if something had been definitively taken away from me. I remember looking in the mirror and not recognizing exactly who I was. Not physically, but inside. It was as if I was just there fulfilling a role, representing someone who accepted everything calmly, while another part of me, deeper, began to move away. I felt sadness, but I didn't cry. I felt angry, but I didn't show it. Everything was contained, compressed into a space that was too small. I learned so well to control myself that even when something broke, I remained silent. That day, I realized that I had missed something important, even though I didn't know how to name it. It wasn't just a specific choice. It was the feeling of having the right to choose. It was the confidence that my will mattered, and it hurt in a strange way, because no one around seemed to notice. The adults continued to speak normally, planning, deciding, laughing at times. The world has not stopped. Only I felt that internal change, and because I had no words to express, I concluded that the problem was mine, always me. I thought maybe it was like that for everyone, that growing up meant accepting these silent losses, that every adult carried this kind of emptiness. So I swallowed once again what I felt and moved on, as I always did. But something had changed. I started to work on automatic. He did what needed to be done, but without involvement, as if I had learned to switch off so I wouldn't feel so much. It was the first time I realized that being quiet could also be a way to disappear. No one noticed my change, at least no one commented. And this confirmed what I already suspected. As long as I obeyed, as long as I didn't cause problems, no one would care what I felt inside. At that time, I began to feel a tiredness that did not match my age. It wasn't physical. It was a constant emotional exhaustion, as if I was always holding something too heavy without ever being able to let go. I still believed that it would pass, that later it would all make sense. That discomfort was temporary. I didn't know that I was learning to live disconnected from myself, a skill that would accompany me for decades. It was on that silent day, without a set date, that something essential broke. Not in a visible way, but in a profound way. And when that happens, no one applauds. No one interrupts. Life goes on. Only you change. I moved on. I did what was expected. I became who they needed me to be. But I left there, that day, a part of me that never came back in the same way. And it took me a long time to realize how much it would cost. Growing up for me never meant freedom. It just meant learning to meet new expectations. When I stopped being a child, no one taught me how to choose. They just showed me new rules, now aimed at the adult I was supposed to become. And I accepted all of them with the same obedience as before. I did what was expected without thinking too much. Study, work, help, take on responsibilities too soon. They said I was mature, trustworthy, someone you could count on. I felt proud of these labels, not realizing that they came with a silent demand to keep canceling myself. Saying no has never come naturally to me. He always seemed rude, selfish, unnecessary. Even when something bothered me deeply, I found a way to justify it. I thought it wasn't so serious, that I could handle, that it was better that way. There was always a reason to keep accepting. In adult life, this began to appear more strongly. I accepted tasks that I didn't want. He remained in uncomfortable situations for too long. He swallowed opinions to keep the peace. And the more I did it, the more people expected me to keep doing it. There was a constant confusion inside me. I did not know how to distinguish what was duty from what was desire. Everything seemed like an obligation. Everything seemed necessary. I felt trapped, but I couldn't point to the bars. After all, no one was explicitly forcing me. I just didn't know how to act otherwise. When something went wrong, I blamed myself. I thought I hadn't tried hard enough, that he should have been more patient, more understanding. I never considered the possibility that maybe I had crossed my own limits long ago. I saw other people imposing limits, refusing requests, changing paths. That caused me strangeness. It seemed too daring, too risky. I believed that this kind of attitude had bad consequences, so I remained firm in my role as someone who always gives in. Over time, this attitude began to affect my relationships. People got used to my availability, with my absence of complaint. I became someone easy to mold, adjusted to the needs of others, rarely to my own. Inside, I felt a growing tiredness. It wasn't just physical, it was a deep wear, as if I was always giving something essential, without ever receiving it back. But I didn't talk about it, not even with myself. I thought that was adult life, that everyone felt that way, they just didn't say. So I kept going, accumulating responsibilities, fulfilling roles, following a script that I never stopped to question. The silence I had learned as a child now manifested itself in another way. It was no longer imposed by adults. It was maintained by me. I kept quiet myself, for fear of conflict, of rejection, of seeming ungrateful. I didn't realize that by avoiding conflict, I was creating one with myself. A silent, constant conflict that corroded my identity little by little. But at that stage, I still believed that holding on was a virtue. I grew up like that, without learning to say no, without learning to choose. just following. And the more time passed, the harder it seemed to imagine a different life, because I didn't know who I was without this constant obedience. When I got married, it wasn't exactly by conscious choice. It was more of a logical sequence than was expected of me. People said that it was time, that it was the next step, that it would bring stability. I listened to everything in silence and agreed, as I always did. I didn't stop to ask myself if that was what I wanted. The truth is that I didn't even know how to recognize a desire of mine anymore. I just went with the flow, believing that at some point it would turn into something right, that the feeling would come later. The relationship started correctly, adequately, without great excesses. There were no major conflicts, but there was also no room for deep conversation. I was constantly making concessions, not realizing that I was repeating the same pattern I had learned in childhood. When something bothered me, I kept it. I thought it was not worth creating tension, that it was better to maintain harmony. I believed that giving in was a way of loving, and so I shaped my life based on the expectations of others. Important decisions came naturally, or so they seemed: where to live, how to live, what to prioritize. I participated, but I never led. I always adapted. I always found a way to agree, even when something inside me resisted in silence. Over time, I began to feel a growing distance between who I was and who I was showing to be. I fulfilled my role, but I felt absent within my own life, as if he were watching everything from the outside without really participating. There were moments of loneliness even though he was accompanied. I felt like I couldn't express doubts, fears, or frustrations, not because someone forbade me, but because I never learned how to do it. Silence was already part of me. When conflicts arose, I was the first to give in, apologizing, trying to fix it, even when I didn't understand exactly what was wrong. I would rather take the blame than face the possibility of rupture. Outsiders saw a stable marriage. They said I was lucky, that I was understanding, and I nodded with a discreet smile, while inside I felt an emptiness that was difficult to explain. Over the years, that feeling became familiar. I didn't expect much. I just followed, complied, kept everything running. Life seemed like a sequence of well-executed obligations. I believed that this was maturity, that to love was to give up, that happiness was an exaggerated concept. So I continued, without question, without asking for more than the minimum emotionally secure. Today, I understand that that marriage was not the result of free choice, but of conditioning. I did what I knew how to do best, obey the script I was given, and it took me years to realize how much it took me away from myself. There was no major disruption in that period, just slow, silent, constant wear. A kind of tiredness that doesn't show up in the photos, but accumulates inside. And I kept carrying it, believing that this was how adult life worked. The years began to pass faster than I expected. One day I was trying to understand my place in the adult world. The next I was already accumulating responsibilities, bills, commitments, and expectations that never seemed to diminish. Life went on, even when I felt stuck inside. The children came, the constant work, the tight routine. I did what was expected of me. I worked hard. I was present in the way I knew I was. I fulfilled my role seriously. People said I was dedicated, reliable, someone who never abandoned his obligations. On the outside, everything seemed correct. There was a structure, an order, a predictability. Inside, however, something remained disconnected. I felt constant guilt, even without knowing exactly what. It was as if I was always owing someone something, always falling short of some invisible expectation. When I felt tired, I told myself that it was normal. When I felt sad, I thought it was ingratitude. After all, I had a stable life, a family, a defined path. Who was I to complain? This thought accompanied me for many years. I rarely talked about what I felt. I didn't want to worry anyone. He didn't want to appear weak, so I swallowed it all and moved on. Silence remained my refuge and my prison at the same time. As time went by, I began to feel the weight of this on my body, a tiredness that did not go away with rest, a constant tension in the shoulders, a tightness in the chest that appeared without warning, but I didn't connect these signals to anything emotional. He just kept going. I've gotten used to putting others first. The needs of family, work, and the people around me always came before mine. And the more I did that, the harder it became to identify what I really needed. There were moments of joy, of course, laughter, achievements, small prides, but they came mixed with a strange sense of absence, as if I were physically present, but not whole, as if something essential was always missing. I watched the time pass and felt a silent pressure to continue. There was no room to stop and reflect. Adulthood seemed to require constant movement, and I obeyed, as I always did. Sometimes, late at night, when all was quiet, old thoughts would come back. Memories of childhood, of that decision that was not mine, of that feeling of having been pushed to a path that I did not choose. But I quickly pushed these ideas away. It didn't seem useful to revisit the past. The guilt, however, remained, a diffuse guilt, without a face, without a name. I felt responsible for not being fully satisfied, for not being happier, for carrying that silent emptiness. I never considered that perhaps I had been molded for this. The years passed like this, one after the other. I continued living, complying, resisting. No big explosions, no big ruptures, just accumulating a tiredness that he couldn't explain, and a guilt that seemed to have no end. Today, looking back, I see that that period was not just a difficult phase. It was the direct consequence of a lifetime of silence. And understanding this took a lot longer than I care to admit. Over the years, I began to realize that something in me was different, even without being able to explain exactly what. It was not a clear pain, nor something that could be pointed out easily. It was more like a silent, accumulated wear and tear that manifested itself in the small details of everyday life. I woke up tired, even after sleeping. I felt a weight on my body that didn't come from physical work, but from something deeper. Sometimes he would stand still, staring at nothing, not knowing the reason for that sudden emptiness. I continued to function, but without lightness. The people around me didn't notice anything wrong. I was still the same as always. Responsible, present, reliable. He fulfilled commitments, solved problems, helped when needed. On the outside, I looked whole. Inside, something was cracked. I had difficulty talking about myself. When someone asked how I was doing, I automatically replied that everything was fine, even when he wasn't. The right words never came. Or maybe I was afraid of what might come out if I actually started talking. There was a discreet sadness that accompanied me. It wasn't intense enough to attract attention, but constant enough to never go away. I got used to it, as someone who learns to live with permanent background noise. I also carried a strange sense of inadequacy. Even though I did everything right, I felt that it was not enough, that something was missing in me, that others seemed to know how to live better, choose better, feel better. I compared myself in silence. Over time, I began to avoid situations where I would need to expose myself emotionally. Deep conversations made me uncomfortable. I preferred to talk about practical, safe matters. Emotion has always seemed too risky a territory for me. These marks did not appear in exams nor in clear words. They showed themselves in the way I withdrew, how I avoided conflict, how I accepted more than I should. They were invisible wounds, but very real. I never associated it with my childhood or the rules I followed. I thought it was simply my way, that I had been born this way, that some people were quieter, more contained, more tired. I accepted that as part of my identity. At times, I felt a sudden urge to change everything, to do something different, to get out of that familiar script. But soon, fear came, fear of making mistakes, fear of disappointing, fear of not knowing who I would be without those rules. So I kept going, day after day, year after year, carrying marks that no one saw but that shaped every decision, every silence, every choice I didn't make. Today I understand that these brands did not come out of nowhere. They were created slowly. From an early age, every time my voice was ignored, every time my discomfort was treated as an exaggeration, every time I was taught to be quiet. Invisible marks are the most difficult to heal, because we come to believe that they are part of who we are. And I believed that for too long. It was only much later that I began to suspect that this constant tiredness was not weakness. It was a consequence. And recognizing this was the first step to something I had never done before, looking at myself honestly. The awakening did not happen all at once. It was not a clear moment, nor a sudden revelation. It was something slow, almost imperceptible, like a crack that starts small and opens up over time. For years, I lived without asking myself questions. But at some point in old age, the questions began to appear on their own. I was already over 70 years old when this started. The routine was too quiet, the days too long. The body no longer ran after time as before, and perhaps that is why the mind found space to go back. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't too busy to think. It was something simple that started it all. A short conversation with no apparent importance. Someone younger commented, almost as if he didn't want anything, that no one should accept decisions imposed for their entire lives. That phrase was not said to me, but it stayed with me, as if it had been placed there on purpose. In the following days, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that it didn't make sense, that each generation was different, that in my time, things were just like that. But the phrase came back. He always came back. And along with it, memories that I had spent my whole life avoiding. I began to revisit the past with different eyes, not as someone trying to justify themselves, but as someone trying to understand. I remembered childhood, the unexplained rules, the constant silence. I remembered decisions made by others, always accompanied by the same absolute certainty. For the first time, something changed in the way I remembered these scenes. Instead of wondering why I didn't react, I began to wonder why no one listened to me. This reversal was small but profound. She touched something that had been dormant for decades. I felt resistance inside me. An old voice said it was too late for that. That rummaging in the past would not bring anything good, that I should be content with what I experienced. That voice has always been very convincing. It was she who kept me quiet for so many years. But another voice, still weak, began to emerge. She didn't scream. He did not accuse. I just asked. I asked if it had all been fair, if I had really had a choice, if the discomfort I felt for so long was just weakness or consequence. This doubt took me off my feet, because if it wasn't my fault, then the whole narrative I built about myself needed to be revised. The idea that I was simply someone who didn't know how to live properly began to lose strength. There were nights when I lay awake remembering old scenes with painful clarity, phrases spoken with authority, silences that are too long, looks that ended any conversation. And for the first time, I felt compassion for that boy who just wanted to understand what was happening. It was not easy to accept this. Acknowledging that I have been silenced hurts almost as much as having been silenced, because it brings with it a deep sadness for lost time, for the choices that never existed, for the life lived within limits that I did not choose. At the same time, there was something new emerging, a strange feeling of relief, like I'm finally putting the weight in the right place, as if after so many years of carrying guilt, I could leave her on the ground for a few moments. I didn't talk about it with anyone, not yet. It was something too delicate. I needed to first accept it within myself. I needed to reorganize memories, feelings, old certainties. It was like rearranging a house after a silent earthquake. The awakening did not bring me ready-made answers. It brought up difficult questions. It brought pain, but I also brought something I never had, honesty with myself. And that, even late, changed the way I started to look at my own history. At that moment, I understood that I could no longer pretend. Something had been revealed, even without clear words. I could no longer continue to say that everything was normal, that everything was fair, that everything was as it should be. There, in old age, when many believe that there is nothing left to be discovered, I began to see a truth that I had waited a lifetime to admit. Maybe I wasn't weak. Maybe I've just been silenced for too long. I'll stay here reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching this? And what about this story has left you? Your words matter more than you realize, and they really get to me. That phrase didn't come right away. It took her time to graduate. At first, it was just a vague feeling, almost forbidden, as if thinking about it was a betrayal of everything I was taught. Still, she insisted on coming back, with more and more force. Maybe it wasn't my fault. For many years, I believed that something was wrong with me, that I was too weak, too sensitive, unable to deal with life as others did. This idea accompanied me in silence, shaping my way of acting, of being silent, of accepting. Questioning her seemed dangerous. But now, looking back more clearly, I began to realize something else. I was not heard. I was not consulted. I was not prepared. I was just directed. And that changes everything, because it's no longer about disability. It's about the absence of choice. That realization hurt. It hurt because it brought with it a deep sadness for everything I carried alone, for all the guilt that didn't belong to me, but that I accepted as mine. For every time I diminished myself to fit into rules that were never made with me in mind. There was a specific moment when this idea was consolidated. I was sitting alone, reliving an old memory, when I realized something simple. I was just a child trying to understand the world with the tools he had, and none of them included power or voice. This realization dismantled me, because I spent my whole life judging that boy harshly, demanding from him courage, firmness, reaction, and I never considered the context in which he lived. I never considered that silence was also imposed. I felt a mixture of emotions that were hard to separate. Sadness for what I lost, anger at what they took from me without asking, and for the first time, a kind of compassion for myself, something I had never allowed myself to feel. It was not easy to accept this, because accepting that it wasn't my fault means admitting that there was injustice. And admitting injustice means acknowledging that people I trusted have wronged me. This is a truth too heavy to swallow at once. I spent days reflecting on this, going back to the same memories but now in a different light, the phrases spoken with authority, silence as an answer, the normalization of everything. Gradually, I understood that this was not care. It was control. This understanding did not bring immediate relief. It brought pain, a clean pain, different from the old guilt, a pain that did not diminish me, but put me in the right place in history, not as guilty, but as someone who has been silenced. I started to feel something new, a strange lightness, still shy, as if an old load was being taken out, piece by piece, not because the past has changed, but because his interpretation was finally changing. For the first time, I was able to say in a low voice, even if only to myself, I did what I could with what I had, and that was enough. This phrase seemed simple, but it carried decades of weight being loosed. There was no celebration, there was no euphoria, just a different silence. A silence that didn't hurt, a silence that welcomed. For the first time, being quiet didn't mean erasing myself. It meant listening to me. At that point, I understood that something fundamental had changed. I could no longer see myself as before. The story I told myself all my life needed to be rewritten, and even late, I was ready for it. After admitting that maybe it wasn't my fault, something changed in the way I breathed. It was not a complete relief, nor an immediate one. It was more like lifting an old weight off my shoulders and realizing that even without it, I still needed to learn to stand in a different way. I wondered for a while if I should talk to anyone about all that. You should confront people from the past, say what I felt, point out what was unfair. The idea seemed heavy to me, not just out of fear, but because I no longer sought external answers. Something inside me had already reorganized. I understood that the confrontation I needed was not necessarily with others. It was with myself, with the story that I agreed to tell for so many years, with the version of me that blamed itself for everything and never forgave itself for anything. There was a moment when I sat alone and spoke out loud, even though no one was listening. I said simple things, but they had never been said. He said that hurt me. He said it was unfair. He said I deserved to be heard. Hearing my own voice saying this was stronger than I expected. I didn't feel angry. I felt sadness. A deep sadness, but honest. Sadness for the lost time, for the choices that never existed, for the silence that has become a habit. But I also felt something different, understanding. And that understanding brought peace. I realized I didn't need an apology to move on, nor recognition. What I needed was to stop denying myself what I experienced, stop softening the past to make it bearable. He had already passed. Now it needed to be understood. Accepting was not the same as justifying. I didn't start to think that everything was right. I just accepted that it happened, and that I survived the way I could. This difference was essential, because accepting freed me from guilt, not from the truth. For the first time, I allowed myself to be proud of that quiet boy. Not because he obeyed, but because he resisted in the only way he knew how. He was not weak. It was adaptable. And that kept him alive, even if in silence. I started to treat myself more kindly. Something simple, but completely new to me. I started to respect my limits, even small ones. I began to listen to my emotions, even when they were confused. It was strange, almost uncomfortable, but also necessary. There was no major external transformation. My life remained similar. But inside, the way I positioned myself changed. I no longer accepted everything automatically. I no longer blamed myself for feeling discomfort. I was no longer so easily diminished. There were conversations that I chose not to have, not out of cowardice, but out of clarity. I understood that some people would not change, and that I didn't need to convince them of anything. My truth was already validated within me. That was my confrontation. Quiet, belated, but real. A confrontation with the past, with the unfair rules, with the role I was given and that I accepted without knowing that I could refuse. By accepting all this, something came to an end, not with noise nor with drama, but firmly. I couldn't change what I experienced, but I could finally change the way I carried this story inside me. And that, even late, was enough to move on more lightly than I ever thought today. When I look back, I no longer see just a sequence of events. I see a whole life shaped by silence, by rules accepted without question, by choices made by others and carried by me. It took me many years to understand this, and even longer to accept it. For a long time, I thought that being quiet was a sign of strength, that enduring was a virtue, that not complaining made me a better person. I was praised for that, rewarded for it. And because of that, it took me a while to realize how much it cost me. I learned early on that certain truths should not be spoken, that some questions bothered him, that disagreeing had consequences, even when no one raised their voice. So I learned to swallow words, feelings, desires. I did it so well that for many years I forgot they existed. Silence accompanied me in all stages of life. As a child, he protected me from confrontation. In my youth, I kept myself on the expected path. In adulthood, it helped me keep everything running. But in none of these moments did he bring me real peace. What he brought was guilt. A constant guilt, difficult to explain. Guilt for not being fully satisfied. Guilt for feeling tired for no apparent reason. Guilt for carrying a void that I didn't know how to name. I believed that this fault was my fault. Today I understand that it wasn't. It was a consequence. Consequence of a life lived more to fulfill expectations than to hear one's own voice. Consequence of having learned to adapt even before learning to choose. I learned that not every rule is fair just because it is old. That not all authority acts out of care. That not all silence is respect. Some rules exist just to keep track. And when we grow up with no room to question, we learn to call it normality. I also learned that children have no way to defend themselves from everything. They trust. They believe. They mold themselves to what is imposed on them. Demanding courage from those who never had a choice is an injustice that I committed to myself for too long. If I could talk to the boy I was, I wouldn't ask him to be stronger. I wouldn't ask him to face anyone. I would just say, "You are not wrong for feeling this way." Sometimes what hurts the most is no one saying that. In old age, when the world becomes quieter, truth finds space. It was only then that I was able to hear what I had spent my whole life suppressing. And despite the pain it brought, it also brought something precious: clarity. Today I know that prolonged silence does not heal. He just postpones. It postpones conversations, postpones decisions, postpones the encounter with one's own truth. But even postponed, this truth is still there, waiting to be recognized. I haven't changed the past. I didn't recover what I lost. I didn't rewrite choices that never existed. But I changed something essential. I stopped blaming myself for having survived the way I could. Today I treat myself more honestly, with more kindness. I listen to my limits. I respect my discomforts. This may seem little to those who have always had a voice, but for someone who lived in silence, it is a new beginning. If you who listen to this story feel a squeeze similar to what I described, don't ignore it. Don't rush to blame yourself. Not everything that hurts is exaggeration. Not all silence is a virtue. Don't wait a lifetime to listen to yourself. Don't accept rules just because they've always existed. Don't confuse control with care. Your voice is not inconvenient. It is necessary. Some truths wait a lifetime to be told. But even late, they still matter. And today, finally, I can say, this truth is also mine. If something in this story touched you, please share this video with someone who might need to hear it right now. What has been said here is not just about one life. It is about patterns that repeat themselves silently within many families and cultures. Sharing is an act of solidarity. It is lending a voice to those who have not yet managed to break their silence. I'll stay here, reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching this? And what about this story has left you? Your words matter more than you realize, and they really get to me.